Don't make these mistakes when you build your raised beds. I'm going to go through 12 common mistakes that will cause you all kinds of trouble. Watch this video to the end and it's going to save you a ton of time and money. Raised beds have become very popular and most people use them for growing vegetables. So if you're new to growing vegetables, stick around till the end and I'm going to give you a link to a free 10-part vegetable growing course. Number 1. Not thinking about irrigation. Raised beds dry out faster than growing in the ground, so they need to be watered more often. Vegetables need a more constant watering regimen than your ornamental beds. We have to grow them quickly so that we get a good harvest before fall. And watering is one of the most important things you can do for your vegetables. Before you even think about where you're going to put your raised beds, think about how you're going to water them. Now, you might get away with just using a tap from the house and running a hose out, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be complicated. And if you're new to gardening, I suggest keeping it simple. Stay away from drip irrigation, which is actually a good solution, but it's more complicated. When you're starting out, keep things simple and see if you even enjoy gardening. A hose works well. What's really nice is if you can leave that hose permanently in location so you don't have to haul it out all the time. So what I do in some of my beds is I'll have a tap in a certain location and then I run a hose around the back of beds to where I need it, and I leave that hose there all summer long. If you live in a cold climate where the water freezes, you'll have to empty that in the fall. But it can stay in place all summer long, and now you have the hose right beside your vegetable bed. And if you do that, you'll water more often and you'll grow better vegetables. Irrigation is the first thing to think about. Mistake number 2, and I think this is the biggest one. I see people making really high raised beds, and I just don't get it. If you're growing on soil, there's no reason to make your bed more than 6 inches high. Now, if you're growing on concrete or a driveway where there's no soil underneath, you'll have to go up to about 1.5 feet. And again, you don't need more than that. So that's a high raised beds. Now, I know some people have disabilities and they raise the bed up for that reason, and that can work very well. But I see a lot of people recommending high raised beds so you don't have to bend down so much when you're gardening. Well, I have news for you. You actually spend very little time bent over in the garden if you do things correctly. And last summer, I actually monitored the time I take for doing that. For something like a tomato plant, I bend over to plant it, which takes 10-15 seconds. I mean, dig the hole, put the plant in, put the soil back, you're done. The rest of the time you're standing up. You're watering, you're standing up. You're harvesting, pulling tomatoes off, you're standing up. If you mulch the way I'm going to describe later on in this video, you never have to weed. So for things like beans and peas and tomatoes, cucumbers, which I grow vertically, you don't bend over. If you're growing things like carrots and beets and they're in rows, they tend to be planted too close together and you do have to thin them out once in a while. So that takes a few minutes. You might even be weeding between them a little bit. And of course you have to plant them. But again, even for planting, I don't bend over very much. I take out my rake the soil, make it smooth. I turn the rake on its end and I use the rake to make the furrow. And then I only bend over to put some seeds in. It takes seconds to do a 50-foot row. Another thing to think about when you're figuring out how high to make these raised beds is how high are the plants at harvest time? My tomatoes grow 5 to 6 feet tall, and those are the staked ones. So I'm harvesting around here. If I make a bed that's 2 feet taller, I'm harvesting up here. It doesn't make much sense to me. I grow a lot of things on trellis. My beans and my Sweet 100 cherries, they're vine. They're 12 feet tall by the end of the summer. If I put them on a 3-foot bed, I can't reach the crop by the end of the summer. So for a lot of crops, lower beds actually work better. Don't make high beds. They don't grow better vegetables than lower beds. As I said, if you're growing on soil, you need no more than 6 inches. And the other benefit of lower beds is the material for them costs less, they're easier to make, and you're going to spend a lot less on the soil to fill them. Number 3, the width of the bed. Now you can make this bed any size you want, but most people can't reach in more than about 2 feet from the edge, 2.5 feet maximum. So making them wider than that is a problem because you can't reach the center. And in North America, wood comes in 8 feet and 10 feet boards. So a 4 by 8 foot bed works out just perfect. You have to make very few cuts and you use all the wood you buy. So I like 4 by 8. And if you're a tall person, you have long arms, well, maybe you go with 10-foot boards, which will give you a 5 by 10 bed. Don't make them any longer than that and don't make them any wider than that. Number 4, soil. There's lots of different formulas promoted on the internet, and I disagree with most of those recommendations. What I see everybody doing is filling their beds with organic material. And that can be compost, it can be peat moss, a soilless mix. Soilless mix has no soil in there. You put this material in the bed, fill it up, and it costs a lot of money to do that. And then next year you come along and it's settled. You're down to half of what you had last year. And everybody goes online and complains about this. Well, why did that happen? Well, the reason is you used the wrong material in the bed. Organic matter is very loose and friable when you buy it, and it settles. Organic matter also decomposes. So over time, that layer will continue to go down and down and down. Every year you have less than you had the year before. So if you fill it with organic matter, you're going to have to top it up every year. And that's where soil is different. Now, when you buy bulk soil, it is fluffed up. They sell it by the volume and you end up paying more if it's fluffed up. So they give it a good fluffing. And gardeners like it that way because it's easier to show. So the first year it will settle. But after that, it stays there. Soil does not decompose. It doesn't go away. So after the first year, wherever that settles to, that's the level of your bed. Triple mix is a very common type of soil that people use. And I don't recommend triple mix either. Now it grows great vegetables. It's 1/3 soil, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 compost. Triple mix, the 3 components are 1/3 each. The problem with that is it's 2/3 organic matter. So triple mix continually gets less and less and less. So what I recommend you do is get topsoil. That has very little organic matter and it's not going to settle very much. To that, add some manure or compost. So the manure and compost component can be in the order of 20 to 30%. It really depends on how good the topsoil is. If the topsoil is fairly loose and sandy, you don't need a lot of the compost. If the topsoil has a lot of clay in it, then add a little bit more compost so it's easier to dig and it's easier for the plant roots to grow in. So start with at least 70% real soil. And a bonus is that it's actually less expensive than all these other options. Mistake number 5. A lot of people make these beds out of wood, and I think that's a very good option. So now you go to the lumber yard to go buy your wood and you see, wow, this stuff's pretty expensive. So let's make it a little less expensive by using skinny boards, what we call sort of 1-inch boards, which is actually only 3/4 of an inch. That's a big mistake. Those 1-inch boards are too flexible. The sides will bow out of the side of the raised bed. Don't go with 1-inch wood. The other reason is that 1-inch rots much faster than 2-inch boards. So if you're making these out of wood, use 2-inch thick boards, which is 1.5 inch in reality. Don't go any thinner than that. Now, some people are concerned about using pressure-treated wood, but our pressure-treated wood today is very safe for gardens. You don't have to worry about that. Years ago, we did use different chemicals which were toxic, but those haven't been around for at least 10 years. So if you're using new boards, you don't have to worry about that. If you can't afford all that wood, then do one of 2 things. Build fewer beds, or don't make them so high. If you follow my advice and make 6-inch raised beds, they're not very expensive. So let's say you're making these beds out of wood. One of the concerns is that the wood rots over time. So how do we make it last longer? Well, a lot of people suggest lining the wood on the inside. Between the soil and the wood, you put some plastic. and that plastic keeps the moisture away from the wood. Well, that sounds good in theory, but that's actually not what happens. Eventually, you get water between the plastic and the wood, and once it's there, it's very hard to come out. As it turns out, lining your boards with plastic actually speeds up the rotting of the wood. So don't bother doing that. Don't put plastic on the sides next to the wood, and don't put plastic in the bottom either. You should not use plastic in a raised bed. If you buy good quality pressure treated wood, it will last you at least 10 years. And I have some in the garden that's 15 years old, and it's just now time to replace that. And these are boards that are buried in the soil. They have soil on both sides, so they stay pretty wet. So you get at least 10 years out of your raised beds, which is pretty good. Mistake number 7. What should you put in the bottom of the raised bed? I see everyone going out and getting cardboard and newspaper and putting that in the bottom. And even worse, sheets of plastic. They don't want the weeds to come up from underneath the raised bed. So the first thing we have to know is, where are you putting your beds? If you're putting these on lawn grass, that's a cool growing grass, so things like Kentucky bluegrass. If you put 3 inches of soil on that, it will kill the grass. It won't grow through. So you don't need anything underneath it. If you're putting this on top of warm growing grasses like Bermuda grass or St. Augustine, they tend to run a little farther. Now, if you put a foot of soil on those, you'll kill the grass. They won't come through. If you're only going to put 6 inches on, then it's not a bad idea to put something at the bottom. And what I would recommend is that you put down newspaper. Lots of layers overlapped. Newspaper rots away faster than cardboard. And cardboard can take a full year to decompose in zone 5 because we have a cool season. Now, if you're in a really warm season, it might decompose faster. But I know you want to get these raised beds built and you want to start planting right away. So you want something that decomposes quickly. For most people who are building these on a lawn, you don't need to put anything underneath. Mistake number 8, not mulching, or mulching with the wrong material. I see a lot of pictures of raised beds with no mulch on them, just the vegetables growing. That's a mistake. Mulch keeps the weeds out, which means you have less bending to do, and it keeps moisture in the ground. And keeping that moisture in is so important for raised beds because they dry faster. Remember, a raised bed is just like a container and they dry very quickly. You want to mulch, but mulch with the right material. You can use compost for mulching, but that tends to grow weeds in it. What I really like is just use straw. You can use hay, but it's more expensive and tends to be weedier, so I like just straight straw. Keep the ground covered with straw all the time. So in my Zone 5 garden, my vegetable garden right now is covered with straw. That straw is slowly decomposing and adding nutrients to the soil. What I do in early spring is I actually move the straw away from where I'm going to plant to allow the sun to warm the soil. It allows me to plant maybe a week earlier. But once I've planted, once the seeds have come up, or once the tomato plant is there, I put the straw back and it stays there for the rest of the summer. Now, the pathways between the raised beds, that can be filled with whatever you want, and wood chips would be an excellent product there. You can use straw too. Straw is a little harder to walk on because it's a little slippery, but it will work. Mistake number 9, not leaving enough space between the beds. Now you have to figure out where you're putting your beds. Some of the spaces between them can be quite narrow, just really wide enough for your body to go through. Other areas should be wider. Think about this. We're going to have to get the soil from the front of the house to the backyard where your beds are probably located. And we need to get that soil near the bed. So most likely you're going to have a wheelbarrow. So you want some of the pathways wide enough for that wheelbarrow so you can easily get to where you're doing the work. And it's even handy for weeding and harvesting and so on. So some of the pathways should be wide. Think about how you're going to get the soil there and make them as wide as your wheelbarrow. Orientation. Now, should these beds face the sun or be perpendicular to the sun? And I see a lot of discussions online about, the right way to do this is this way. Well, there is no right way. Vegetables like lots of sun. So put your beds where your garden gets the most sun. The orientation is not so important. Once the beds are in place, what is important is to plan where you put your vegetables. You want the short plants on the sunny side and the tall plants on the shady side. If you put a big tomato in here, you don't want it shading your little carrot. Carrots have to be on the sunny side. Now, I like to grow a lot of things vertically. So my peas and beans, even a lot of my tomatoes are vertical because they're vines. My cucumbers, all vertical. So I like beds where the back has some sort of a trellis where I can go vertical. And then I grow the shorter crops in front of that. Mistake number 11. You've got it in your head that you're going to do vegetable gardening. You're all excited. This is your first garden. You can't wait to get going. The biggest mistake people make is they go too big. If you've never gardened before, I highly suggest you make 1, maybe 2 beds. I see people making 8, 10 beds, and then they find out they don't like gardening. Or they find out vegetable growing is not as easy as it looks. Start small. Start with 1 bed, a 4x8 bed. Give it a try. Learn what you're doing. If you really love it, like I do, then make a few more beds next year. Don't start too big at once. Growing vegetables is a little harder than it's made out to be. There's a lot to learn. Mistake number 12. This isn't really a mistake, but I see a lot of stuff online that makes it sound as if raised beds are magical somehow. If you build a raised bed, you'll have no trouble growing vegetables. That's a complete myth. To be honest with you, I don't use raised beds except in some very special situations. Now, that's not entirely true. Okay, when people talk about raised beds these days, they all have walls. They have wooden sides or concrete sides. When I started gardening a long time ago, I started in my early 20s. I made raised beds. But in those days, what we would do is we would just pile up the soil. So we would take the soil from the pathways, put it on the bed, and then we would only walk on the pathways. That gave us a bed that was maybe 4 or 5 inches higher than the pathways. And that worked really well. And I've grown in the ground my whole life. I don't use raised beds. I'd rather grow in the ground. It's easier for watering. I have to do much less of it. I don't have to build these things. I don't worry about rotting wood and replacing my raised beds. I do have a raised bed beside my garden out back, but it's made with stone. It's never going to rot. And I only did that because my vegetable garden is actually on a slope and I had to raise it up a little bit. Before you get into raised bed gardening, think about your ground. It's probably not nearly as bad as you think it is. But in any event, I don't see a problem with making 6-inch raised beds. It will give you a good start and allow you to grow a lot of vegetables. But raised beds are not magical. You still have to learn how to grow vegetables. Now I'm going to help you with that. I've put together a series of videos for growing vegetables, a 10-part course, and I'll put a link to that in the top right-hand corner. Have fun gardening.